Well, welcome everyone to our June webinar on building a culture of analytics. As you see, if it still popped up and you haven't responded, please take our poll. We will review those results in a little bit. Good morning, I'm Robert Sunker. I'm the Executive Vice President overseeing offerings and solutions for RevGen partners. And you won't see on camera, but I have to thank some fellow RevGeners for their support and hard work helping put on this webinar today. Lisa Walverd is our Director of Marketing Communications, and our two co-leads of our analytics and insights practice are both Pero Dukowski and Ian Foley. So thank you all. I'm just going to spend a few minutes getting us kicked off and then introduce you to our speaker today, Donald Farmer. And to do so, I just want to give a quick intro of RevGen partners. If you don't mind clicking forward, Lisa. So RevGen, first and foremost, is a business and technology consulting firm. We help clients navigate disruption and create opportunities to thrive. Our services span three areas: analytics and insights, which we're talking about today, customer experience, and digital enablement. And we get to serve clients across dozens of different industries from mid-market to Fortune 50. And we're super proud of the fact that 90% of our clients re-engage us. I feel very fortunate as consultants that we get the benefit of observing what works and what doesn't work across several types and sizes of organizations. And given our value statement, given our value of stewardship and our why statement with events like this, we get to share our knowledge and our network, Donald Farmer, in hopes that it can make a positive impact on your organization. So this is an interesting topic. Why are we talking about it? Why does it even matter? If you look at this quote from Jim Barksdale, former Netscape CEO and FedEx COO, if we have data, let's look at data. If all we have are opinions, let's go with mine. And of course, the little cartoon there mimics the same sentiment. Honestly, replace Jim's reference with yourself, your CEO, your team, lead, whomever. This is the heart of the conversation. In an age with where data is an asset, and while some will continue to rely on their experience, intuition, and maybe even authority to run their business, those that augment that with data throughout the organization tend to be more nimble, faster to market, more profitable, etc. So today's webinar is not a technical conversation. There are plenty of webinars and white papers filled with great knowledge about analytics tools, architectural approaches, data governance, etc. Those are all important. And the often most overlooked part of the conversation is the people, their relationship with and their understanding of the data itself. And I personally get a bit excited about the power of data because using facts and truth, I believe, creates a culture of equity and respect versus the game of, quote, the one with the strongest opinion or most power wins. So with that, let's end the poll and show the results. And like I said, we invite very honest people to our webinar. So I feel like y'all were honest with yourselves, and what you would expect is a higher proportion of people right there in the middle. That's where we feel like analytics and insights has really gotten to as an organizational capability, is most folks are using it to measure good performance, tweak performance, identify areas of poor performance. A lot fewer organizations use it throughout their day-to-day strategy and decision making, or even use it to unlock new opportunities in markets. But with a data-driven culture, maybe you can start moving up that maturity curve. So thank you all for replying. I'm kind of curious who said what's data, but welcome to the webinar. We'll get you started. So thanks. You can close the poll when applicable. And so a few logistics. The overall agenda is we're going to have Donald spend most of the time sharing his thoughts and experience with us. I'll share a little bit at the end about RevGen's point of view on the topic. We will have Q&A at the end also, so please, throughout the webinar, use the Q&A feature in Zoom to ask a question. Some may get answered as we go, and some may be held until the end. So either Donald or I can answer them. A couple quick tips for a good webinar for your sake is, one, make sure you're exercising a growth mindset. Hopefully you attended today to learn something new, not just confirm what you already know. 2, look for at least one new nugget of knowledge. And then 3, pass that on. Use it yourself, but also find somebody that you would like to share that nugget with that would benefit from it. And hopefully, most importantly, identify one action, whether it be big or small, that you can take now to start creating a data-driven culture. So without further delay, I will introduce you to our guest speaker, Donald Farmer. We met Donald years ago at an analytics conference when he was speaking about the topic of innovation. And RevGen actually engaged Donald ourselves to help him, or to have his expertise help us foster our own innovation culture within our teams. And that focus was really helping our teams find and use their talent to bring new and higher client value to our clients. So we couldn't pass up the chance to host him for y'all's benefit too. Donald, you helped us think differently, so we hope you can do the same for others. I'll read a quick bio on Donald so you know who you're hearing from today. Donald is an internationally respected speaker and writer with over 30 years of experience in data management and analytics. He advises investors, software vendors, and enterprises on data and analytics strategy. Donald led teams at Microsoft and Click, building some of the most important and innovative analytics platforms on the market. He works globally with teams from the newest startups to some of the world's largest businesses developing strategies for analytics and innovation. So thank you, Donald, for being here, and take it away. The Zoom is all yours.
Thank you very much. It's a great pleasure to be here. As you said, I've known RevGen for a few years, and I've always been impressed by your work and the commitment to innovation and the commitment to sort of a use of data and insight with both integrity and an innovative approach, which I think is very valuable. So yeah, I'm delighted to be here and talking with you today. And let's start with it's interesting that somebody said, what's data? I knew there would be somebody who would answer the question that way. And I think it's a fascinating question, actually. And we could spend an entire webinar talking about the nature of data. And I don't think we want to get into that. But there are these phrases that, today we talk about data all the time in business. And we talk about data as an asset, and we've used this phrase very often. And what I want to suggest is that data isn't an asset, but unless you apply analytics to data, unless you apply knowledge and insight to data, it's really a wasted asset. In fact, it's not even an asset, it's a cost center. It sits there taking the cost of storage and the cost of processing and the cost of protecting it. And if you're not doing anything with it, it really is a wasted asset. And assets, they cost money. They take money to protect them. They cost money to maintain them. And data without that kind of work to protect and maintain it, like any other asset, will decay in value. So data is an asset, but it's an asset when you apply knowledge work to it in order to get value from it. That's when you start to realize the value of the asset. And data and knowledge work to go together, of course. And one of the things I want to suggest here is that analytics has changed a lot in the last few years. In fact, it's changed a lot, certainly, since the time I got involved with doing data analysis at first. So I have this kind of vision of who is the new analyst. And I think I contrast that to maybe who is the kind of previous generation of analysts who were working with analytic technologies, perhaps in the early 2000s, the late 90s, early 2000s. And several things have changed dramatically since that time. So I always choose my clip art carefully. People think my webinars are mostly pictures, which is true, but they're not just random pictures grabbed off the web. I actually think fairly carefully about the pictures I'm choosing. So what have we got here? We've got the new analyst in a nutshell. First of all, the new analyst is a woman. Now, not exclusively, but back in the 90s, certainly when I was working in data analytics, it was regarded as a highly technical area in which there were very few women involved. And nowadays, in fact, I look around the business intelligence world in particular, and I see a lot of women involved there. And that's a great thing in itself, and it's important to bring a sort of diversity of viewpoints, but it's very noticeable compared to, say, the late 90s, early 2000s. The other thing is that this lady's using a Mac. And that's pretty interesting because, again, back in the 90s or early 2000s, you would have thought of the Mac as being something that was used by artists, musicians, architects, perhaps, but it wasn't the sort of computing tool that you would use in the world of business, or more specifically, you wouldn't use it in the world of data and analytics. But something has changed in the last 10 years for sure, and certainly in the last 5 years, which is that data and analytics have now become seen as a creative practice. If you look at the blogs about data visualization, you look at the blogs about data and analytics, what you'll see more and more is people speaking about it as a creative function. And it's about the beautiful visualizations that you can create and the innovative insights that you can have. In other words, rather than being something that was just done at a standard corporate workstation, the work of data and analytics has now become a creative practice. I do want to suggest one other thing which is important, is that in addition to a Mac, she's also got a Rolodex sitting there at the side of her machine. And well, that's a little sarcastic, but what I intend by having that there is I want to show that some of the technologies we use are still legacy technologies. Just because we're using the latest creative technologies doesn't mean that we don't still have legacy systems, and indeed in some ways very, very old functional systems within our organizations that we also use. So this is a new analyst. She's a woman, she's diverse, she has a Mac, she's creative, and yet there's still traditional technologies which have their place to play in this new world. The other thing about the new analyst is that there's a set of skills and tools and access to data and to people and ownership of a process, which is quite unique. And one of the things I want to suggest is that the skills and tools, the access and ownership are not just there by default. In fact, they're not even assigned to this person. In fact, we have these skills and tools and access and ownership informally. Now, what do I mean by that? I certainly don't mean by informally that we have them in the way that people used to talk about, the kind of shadow IT systems that hid under the surface, which always was a problem. If people weren't provisioned with access and ownership, then very often they would just get that access and ownership by going round the company systems, by going round the systems of governance and security. And I can remember many examples of this from my career, where I've seen people, we used to talk about the flying floppy network, where data was copied onto a floppy disk and then, or nowadays onto USB stick, of course, and then shared around in a way which was, ungoverned and unmanageable. And by informal, I do not mean that. What I mean here is that the skills and tools and access and ownership that somebody has is not necessarily a core part of their business function. And it certainly doesn't, if you like, follow from their position in the company hierarchy or in the Active Directory or in the organizational structure. It comes from the work they do themselves. So for example, the skills of data analysis. Yes, for sure, your data analysts may be highly skilled and highly trained, coming out with degrees in computer science or in data science, for example. But many people who do powerful analytics in our companies today have skills that they've learned on the job. And that's kind of important. And the tools they have, there's been an important shift in the use of tools. When I worked at Microsoft and when I worked at Click, we were developing technologies that we called self-service technologies. And one of the interesting things about self-service technologies was that they were very often tools of choice. If you look at the business intelligence environment today, you'll see tools which are provisioned by IT, but you'll also see in almost every business people using tools of choice, tools that they have discovered because they give better visualizations, which they prefer, or techniques that they can use, which are not there in the tools which are provisioned by IT. And again, these people aren't breaking rules. They're not attempting to get around the IT system. They're actually attempting to work with it and to make it more creative and more effective by using their tools of choice. The access, now by access, I mean both access to the data and access to the people. Access to the data, again, when I say it's informal, I certainly don't mean that it's unofficial or that in some way it's breaking any of the data security, data governance, or privacy rules in an organization. It's very important that we don't do that. But what I do mean is that where you have a set of data rules which can be applied, data access rules which may be applied using, say, Active Directory or using a corporate structure in order to assign those rules, there's always in every organization one or two people who have access outside of that, which has been officially provisioned to them, but it doesn't follow from their role in a hierarchy. And why? Well, because these are the data people. These are the people who, despite their role, or instead of, in addition to their role, have the skills and the knowledge and the tools to use data effectively. And so they get more access, or they get different access from other people. And similarly, their ownership of processes may be informal. Just because you're the data analyst in a production environment, say in a manufacturing company, doesn't mean that you're not fascinated by what's going on in marketing, and you're probably looking at some of that data and you've taken ownership of a process. In fact, you may even have invented your own process for combining the data between two systems or bringing into the enterprise the data stories, the data narratives that pull the whole business together. And nobody's given you that job. Nobody said you must go and do this, because nobody would formally identify that as a role. In fact, the role has emerged informally from the work that you do. And that's when I look at enterprises and I find the successful data analysts, it's nearly always people who have taken their own ownership of a problem. As a result of their ownership of that, they've been given access, which is informal, outside the standard hierarchies. They've brought their own tools to the job in many cases, and the skills they have are skills that they have developed themselves. So this is the new analyst, creative, insightful, but informally developing all these aspects of it. And I say informal doesn't mean outside the rules. It means in addition to traditional roles that they otherwise would have. So this informal skills that they bring, one of the things I want to suggest is that the informal skills are not just data analysis skills. In fact, there's a set of informal skills that we can all bring to a role, which are in many ways much more important than any of the formal aspects that you might learn. So for example, if you're working in a tool like Power BI, there's a language which goes along with Power BI from Microsoft. It's called DAX, D-A-X. It's a fairly complex language. There's a lot of powerful things you can do with it. You may learn that. You may go on a training course to learn that. And that's a very useful skill to have. But there's other things that you can still do with Power BI even without that formal skill. Similarly, you may go on a training course for whatever applications that have been provisioned by the company, and the training course will be very useful. But there's things that no training course teaches you which actually make the difference between being a good analyst and a great analyst, or a competent analyst and an insightful analyst. And what I want to suggest is that these informal skills, which really make the difference, are ones which we have, again, as a result of our life experience, if you like, rather than any formal training that we've done. And yet these are the skills which can really make the difference and take your analytics to a next level. So I'm going to go through a number of these skills and give you some examples of how they work. And I'm going to do this at a fairly high level, but I'm hoping that you can think about how you use these skills yourself and apply them in your own role. And the first one I want to talk about is the type of knowledge you have of the system. Now, I need to explain these pictures. I say I choose my pictures carefully, but that doesn't mean they don't need explanation. On the right-hand side, you might not know what's going on there. The left-hand side is pretty clear. Somebody's using a GPS. But on the right-hand side, I have somebody on a motorbike with a map of London in front of them. And if you've ever visited London, you'll see these people riding around on motorbikes with maps stuck to the front of the motorbike. And is that because they're lost? Is it because they don't have a GPS? Well, no. What they're actually doing is training to be London cab drivers. London cab drivers are kind of famous around the world for their ability to get you absolutely anywhere. And that's because they have memorized every street in Greater London, tens of thousands of streets. They know the routes, they know, and they have to sit an exam, which is known as the knowledge. And this examination is a very, very challenging. It's actually extraordinary. If you're ever sitting in a London cab, you're sitting with somebody who has mastered a cognitive skill which is probably beyond anything that we could manage ourselves. They are, in a sense, geniuses at navigation. And what they have is a complete knowledge of the City of London. And in the world of navigation and the world of understanding how people navigate, we call this survey knowledge, which is they have a complete knowledge of the system and how it all hangs together. On the other hand, you may have somebody who uses a GPS. And for example, if I go to visit a city like where I don't live, like Denver, for example, or New York, I know how to get around. I mean, I roughly know my way around Manhattan. I certainly know how to get to my hotel and the airport and some offices. If I'm in Denver, I know how to get to specific places within Denver, but I actually don't know how the whole city is laid out. I don't know how the neighborhoods relate to each other. I don't know how the roads map around those neighborhoods. In other words, I have route knowledge. I know how to get somewhere, but I don't have knowledge of how the whole system hangs together. And so one of the first questions we have to ask ourselves as analysts within a system is, what kind of knowledge do we have of this system? Do we have route knowledge or survey knowledge? And I can give you an examples of how these things sometimes compare. I recently was doing some work with a company which is in construction, and they hired a data analyst who would be able to do some really interesting work on inventory management and optimizations of all the different aspects of the construction business. A lot of data there. They knew nothing about construction. They were a data analyst. And they started to learn some basic things about where the data is and how the data fits together and what's going on. But of course, they didn't understand construction, didn't understand the entire process, didn't know what a concrete pour was or a concrete test, didn't know what, how to do the rebar calculations, all these sort of things. So they had route knowledge of some specific pieces of the system, and only over a long period of time would they be able to build up survey knowledge of the system. And then I sometimes look at IT departments and I find people who've got fantastic survey knowledge of the entire enterprise. They really know how all the different pieces of the data architecture fit together. But they may have very limited knowledge of the very specific processes which go on, for example, within finance. They might not know exactly how the order to cash system, actually, what all those different steps are. They may know exactly where to find the tables. They may know where to find the systems within the ERP system that makes all this work, but they don't necessarily know how all the steps of the order to cash process, the order it has to happen in, and what the business function of each of these steps are. In other words, they have survey knowledge of IT, but they only have route knowledge of the business. And similarly, the other way around, you probably have survey knowledge of a business function, but you may only have route knowledge of the IT system, meaning you know where to get your apps, you know where to get your reports, you know where to get your dashboards. So one of the things we have to consider is, in terms of your data analysts, what knowledge do they have? What types of knowledge do they have? And of course, one of the things you want is people to have, nobody can have survey knowledge of everything. You want to have the right mix of survey knowledge and route knowledge, and you want to make sure that the people who have survey knowledge are speaking to the people who have route knowledge and vice versa, so that you bring the diversity of knowledge in the organization into play so they can work together. Another very important informal skill we have is essentially just the informal skill of analysis in general. And there's a 4-step pattern here that I want to explain to you, which I use all the time. I use it in 2 ways. I use this in design. I use it in designing applications, and I use it in designing dashboards, and I use it in designing analytic systems. But it's also a way of thinking of the analytic process that you have to support. As an organization, do you support this analytic process? As an architect, does your architecture support this analytic process? And the 4-step process comes from library science. You have to think of library science as being the original big data problem. How do people find their way in a library and find something? And if you walk into a large public library, you can't possibly know the entire system. At least it doesn't feel that way. And then libraries also had an even bigger big data problem when they started to deal with issues like microfilm and microfiche, vast amounts of data and storage that were difficult for people to find. So there's a 4-step process which involves orientation, glimpsing, examining, and acquiring. And I just want to walk you through this a little bit and to give you, I think, some sense of how this works in the world of analytics. But I'm going to fall back on the library example because a library is something we're all familiar with, and it gives you as a very good model for thinking about it. What I'd like you to do is then take this mental model of analytics and transpose it from the library into your business environment. So let's start with orientation. Orientation is a great one. So this is one of my favorite libraries in the world. It's the National Library of Scotland. And I spent a lot of time there as a kid and as a young man in this library. And one of the things about this library is it's vast. You're only seeing a very small part of it. It's a national library after all. And one of the first things you have to be able to do in any library of any size is understand where are you? You have to be able to orient yourself. And orientation doesn't just mean knowing where you are. It also means knowing where you can go. Where can I go? If I'm in a history department and I'm looking for a book, say, on Scottish history, but it turns out that I also need to look up Scottish geology or Scottish geography, or I need to look up modern history, or I need to look up Irish history, how would I get to those departments? So knowing where you are is one part of orientation. But orientation also involves knowing where you can go. What are your possibilities from where you are? Now, in our analytics systems, orientation is very important. When you look at a dashboard, you come in the morning, you switch on your machine, you look up some dashboards, you immediately have to be able to orient yourself. What am I looking at? What data is this? And is it fresh? Is it new? Is it up to date? Is it sales data? Is it marketing data? Has it been refreshed overnight? Is it a week old? Is it a month old? And from that, you also need to be able to orient yourself. Where can I go from here? Can I navigate? If this data is a week old, can I navigate to 2 weeks ago? How would I do that? Is there a back button? Is there a forward button? Is there a menu where I can pull up other things? How is that menu organized? That's all orientation. So the first thing you have to be able to do in an analytics system is orient yourself, not just to know where you are, but where you can go from there. That's really the first step of analysis. The next step is kind of interesting. It's glimpsing, being able to glimpse something. And what do I mean by glimpsing? Well, this is the bookshelf that sits behind my desk when I'm working, and it includes books that I frequently look up. And there's several things about this bookshelf which might be interesting or might not. Well, first of all, I do quite a lot of work in technology, and if you are familiar with, say, the Wiley range of books by the publisher Wiley, then you know that they have a kind of black spine with red kind of bands at the top and bottom, and you'd immediately be able to pick out a couple of Wiley books here about data mining and data analysis using SQL and Excel. Perhaps. You might be able to, on the bottom left-hand side, spot a book called The Brain of the Firm. And if you looked at that, you'd almost immediately notice that it looks actually rather old. Even the typography looks kind of old and old-fashioned. On the other hand, if you look at the top right-hand side, there's a bright yellow book called AI Superpowers by Kai-Fu Lee. That would immediately stand out at you. And there's various books that you can see there. Now, one of the most interesting things about glimpsing is, of course, you don't need to read all these books. In fact, all you need to be able to do is glance along the spines, pick out some keywords. Oh, the new IT. Oh, meeting design. Oh, teams and markets. Oh, firm art. You know, there's all sorts of things there that you could pick out. And all you're doing here is glimpsing what is interesting to you. Because you can't possibly, if you didn't have the opportunity to glimpse, you'd actually have to go and look through every one of these books. If imagine they were all kind of bound in brown paper bindings, or the old kind of library bindings where everything was bound in a kind of leather binding with the same kind of embossing on it, how would you glimpse anything? How would you know that anything was interesting? You would actually have to painstakingly read every title and every author's name to know if it was interesting to you or not. While here you can glimpse, you can see things, and book designers put a lot of effort, of course, into making their books glimpsable. So glimpsing is a very important part of that. And one of the things I wanted to ask yourself is, in our analytics design and in our analytics architecture, can people glimpse things? Or do they have to painstakingly look at everything all the time? I look at a lot of reports from clients and customers. And a lot of the reports are designed in a way that gives everybody all the information they can need. But you can't glimpse everything because the typography and the coloring and the layout and the structure of the report doesn't really help me to see what's outstanding or what's noticeable in that. I can't glimpse something. So glimpsing is a really important part of this. And this is where visualization often comes in. A really good visualization will help you to glimpse through the use of color, through the use of layout, through the use of good design, what's going on. But having glimpsed something and having noticed something, oh, that sales number looks worrying, and perhaps it's wrong, perhaps it hasn't been updated, perhaps that one department, in fact, is using data that's a week old and everybody else is using up-to-date data. How would I even know that? Well, now I need to go to the next step, which is examining. Now, in examining, and again, imagine you're in a library and you've glimpsed a book that's interesting. How do you know it is the right book for you? Well, you could take it out and take it away and read it all, but in fact, before you do that, you examine it. And, you know, in the case of a book, you'll look at the title and you'll look at the chapter headings and maybe flick through and look at the index, maybe look at the diagrams, the pictures, maybe look at the author name, the blurb on the back, that sort of thing. In other words, you make an assessment of whether this is interesting or not. And very importantly, at this point, you still haven't done the big work of reading the book. You're still at the browsing stage, if you like. So having oriented yourself and having glimpsed something, now it's time to examine it. And you could look at these sales numbers and say, oh yeah, they haven't been updated yet. They're a week out of date. That's interesting. I should probably find out why. I should probably find out if there's a problem. So there's a point of examining something. And does your analytic system, does your analytic interface, your application, your dashboard, or even your architecture support this step? If your architecture only supports you having glimpsed something and then you have to drill into all the detail to find out what's going on, it's still not giving you that kind of interactivity, that ability to work both casually and in a focused way with the data. So in this case, the ability to kind of casually examine something is very important. And then the next step, having found that indeed there's a problem here, well, now you need to do something with it. And in the library, of course, you take the book away and you've got the opportunity to do this. But what does acquiring mean in the analytics sense? Well, for me, acquiring in the analytics sense means being able to do something with your discovery. And I have to tell you, I'm very critical of business intelligence applications in particular, even the ones I've worked on, to be honest, which they are often very, very good at taking you through all these steps. They allow you to orient, they allow you to glimpse, they allow you to examine. But now what do? I found something. Now what do I do? What action can I take? What can I do with this nugget of knowledge that I've found? And I say, to be honest, we haven't done a good job of that in the analytics industry. That doesn't mean it's not possible to do something. And it certainly doesn't mean that it's not possible to build your architecture, to build your collaboration tools in your environment in such a way that you can do this. And this brings me to this next step. What do we do about what we find? Well, what we do with what we find is we collaborate on it. Alan Weber of Fast Company magazine said this great thing, that in the new economy, conversations are the most important form of work. And he doesn't mean just hanging around a water cooler chatting, of course. He means that in the new economy, in the information economy, where we all have data, we all have access to information, the real distinguishing feature of any business is what you do with that data. And that's in the form of conversations that you have with it. I love this example of the power of data-driven conversations. It's a rather off-the-wall example, to be honest, but it's interesting. This is these are charts of the price of sardines in markets in southern India. And these fish markets are where subsistence fishermen, some of the poorest people in the world, bring their produce, their catch every day to be sold. And you can see that the prices are basically random, until the point where cell phones were introduced. And as soon as cell phones were introduced, and remember, this is like, you can look at this is like 250 weeks of data. This is 5 years of data. There's a dramatic difference, because just being able to collaborate on the data, being able to have conversations on it, dramatically changes the pricing. Now, what's important here is not necessarily that the price goes up or down. In fact, that it stabilizes. The prices are so random before this, that because there's no collaboration, that nobody would be able to do any form of economic planning, whether personal or at the level of the community, because nobody knows what from day to day what's going to be happening. The phones enable communication, they enable collaboration, they enable discussion, they enable competition, and as a result, the price dramatically stabilizes to the extent that you can even see little patterns here of prices going up during the monsoon season. You can see the little increases and things. So now people can start to plan, and people can start to plan both personally and at a community level. This is driven entirely by the fact that we can have conversations about the data, that we can collaborate. And that's really the power of collaboration. One of my friends, Scott Davis, once said this very significant kind of phrase for me, that ultimately people don't trust data. Their trust is collaborative. They trust other people. If you are looking at the latest report that comes, it has sales numbers in it, do you trust that in the sense that you're going to go back and evaluate all the data and check that it came from the ERP system properly, and check that all the data transformations occurred correctly, and check that all the calculations were done correctly? Probably not. What you actually trust is that the IT department has done their job. You actually have a trust in people. And when we're having collaborative conversations about data, it's the trust in people that actually matters. The data itself, and don't get me wrong, if they get the data wrong, if they get the calculations, the transformations wrong, then your trust is gone. But it does always trust in them, not trust just in the data. In other words, one thing I want to get across here is this sense of trust in analytics is not a technical trust, it's always a human trust. This is why we talk about the culture as being so important. Edward Deming, a very, very famous phrase, he was an American statistician, said that without data, you're just another person with an opinion. And his point here was that if you we talked about this a little bit earlier as we were looking at kind of rather funny cartoon of somebody saying that with no data, trust my opinion. The idea here is that data somehow brings a sort of almost magical quality, that suddenly you're going to be objective just because you've got the data. And I want to suggest that there's some truth to that, but not enough truth. That the idea that somehow data can make you objective on its own isn't quite true. In fact, I often say that even with data, you're still just another person with data and an opinion. We don't get rid of our opinions just because we've got data. The data may change our opinion, which is great, but we still have the biases, we still have the presumptions, and we still have the assumptions that we make when we come to our work. We bring that with us to the world of data. The world of data doesn't break through that, even though it can change some of our ideas. In other words, we have to understand this human process of working with data in order to work with it effectively. Michael Lewis, who wrote Moneyball, has this great saying. He says that an explanation is where the mind comes to rest. And that's actually very important. When you feel that you've found an explanation, what actually happens is, to a certain extent, you've relaxed. You let down your guard and you say, oh yeah, that's it. That explains it. That's the way we say it. That explains it. And now we're comfortable. We don't need to dig into it any further. One of the great reasons that we want diversity in our analytic teams or in our organizations is because different people, their mind comes to rest in different places. The key, I think, to a lot of this is to understand a difference between the work that we do at a personal level and the organizational level. I have these pictures here, as I always choose my pictures carefully. In Scotland, I worked on an adult literacy program in a prison, which was really about taking a very small number of people who had fallen through the educational system and had come out of school illiterate or functionally illiterate. And as a result, they often fell into criminal behavior because there was nothing else they could do. They couldn't apply for jobs. They couldn't apply for housing. They often couldn't even apply for benefits. And so they really struggled just to get by in our society and often fell into a criminal process. And it turned out if these people wanted to turn their lives around, and they nearly all did, the first thing they could do was start to learn to read and write functionally and become more functional. And if they could make that breakthrough, then they very rarely fell back into their own old ways. So that was an example of personal literacy, where it really made a difference to somebody to be literate in a society which was literate. But there's also work that I do today with a nonprofit called Pratham, which is an Indian nonprofit which helps with the development of literacy in India. And the problem there is that too many people in the society, as many as 40%, are actually functional illiterate. And that means that they can't have the conversations, they can't have the numerate and literate conversations that can help to transform the society. And you saw the example just of the fishermen, how important that was to be able to transform their society. So one of the things I want you to think about is when you're talking about skills, when you're talking about data literacy, when you're talking about analytic skills, are you thinking about improving the experience of individual people in your organization? Or are you actually talking about organizational literacy, where you're trying to increase the communication and collaboration on data and insight across the entire organization in order to transform your company? And it's a very important distinction to make. And of course, that's a very important change in your strategy. If you're focused on personal literacy, I want to have these one or two expert analysts who can do things, or I have these few people who need training in order to get up to the standard of literacy. That's a very different problem statement from I want to make my organization as a whole more literate in their use of data and their use of analytics. So I always emphasize this. Data literacy is not only a personal skill, it's an organizational skill. In fact, I sometimes think when you think about it as a personal skill, it is maybe a little patronizing. Oh, you're data illiterate is maybe not quite the way sometimes that we should talk about it. And it's one of the reasons that I like to talk about culture rather than specifically about literacy. And we can evolve this. We can evolve it by helping people with what I call their craft, which is the work that they do. And I say it in this broad term because I don't know what work your people do. It could be in manufacturing, it could be in marketing, it could be in finance, it could be in HR. They have a craft. The elaboration is, do we want to do it really well? Do we want to do it better than we've ever done it before? And then there's this sense of belonging and sharing. Do we feel that we belong to an organization, to a community of practice, which is aiming for those ideals to be better at their craft? And then are we sharing, or are we creating silos? And if you can think of developing along these four axes, improve the craft that people do by doing it more excellently than ever before, with a sense of belonging, that this is a shared practice, and then that sense of sharing and collaboration that goes into it, and developing those skills. We can talk about this in the terms of communication, that we can be public in our communication or private in our communication, and direct or indirect. And a good example of that is being able to talk directly. Today, for example, I'm doing a webinar with you, which means that it's public. Everybody can listen to this, and it's synchronous in the sense that it's live. Now, if I was just having a one-to-one conversation with Robert over Zoom, then that would be private and synchronous. If I sent you all an email, or I sent you a group email to everyone, or I had a team chat, that would be public and asynchronous, because you could be chatting with me and I don't need to respond straight away. I could be responding tomorrow. And similarly, if I send an email to Robert, that would be private and asynchronous. You can't see it, and he doesn't need to respond to me straight away. We would be communicating in a kind of time-shifted manner. And one of the things I want to suggest to you is that we need to understand these quadrants of communication. And in fact, a really well-functioning business uses all of these forms. And a really well-functioning manager, a really well-functioning analyst is very careful about the corner of this quadrant that they choose to be in at any one time. They don't do everything in just one segment of the quadrant. They look to see what is the appropriate form of communication that I should be using. And does it work? Well, I like George Wiley's phrase. He's a Scottish artist, and he said, you don't need to know how something works to know it's not working. In other words, you don't need to be an expert to know when things are not going well. You may need to be an expert to fix it, but all of us can contribute in terms of understanding what works and what doesn't work within our organization. To fix this, I often suggest that the traditional roadmap is less successful than trying to understand, for example, what I call a game plan. And I think of a game plan as being something which is not linear, but actually enables you to move through different elements of this as it would be appropriate. So the practice I tend to develop is, say, not everybody needs to rush to the top right-hand side and become cultural in their use of artificial intelligence. It might be quite appropriate for somebody to be using ad hoc, artificial intelligence in an ad hoc way on a single project. It might be important to be doing reporting and visualization as a strategy, but maybe you use predictive analytics just in a tactical manner. In other words, there's no one place that you need to be. That's going to be, you may need to have different departments and different positions on the game plan, and you may need to have different tactics for getting there. So for example, here's a flow that I built with a client for how they can build their technology out in a strategic way. And it turns out that, yeah, they want their KPI dashboard to be something that's cultural. Everybody should be looking at this every day, and critical part of the business culture. But the smart actions and the autonomous workflows, well, they're just tactical. They would use them, very important, those advanced technologies, but they wouldn't be used in strategic applications. But their executive dashboard absolutely is strategic. And maybe their kind of operational dashboard is tactical and something that's used for making short-term decisions. But the important point here is it's not a rush to the top right-hand side. It's a question of understanding where each of these individual miniature projects, if you like, because each of these projects is self-contained, can have the most and best impact for the organization as a whole. So with then, I want to kind of pass over again to RevGen so they can kind of say how they work with this kind of attitude and this kind of approach in their business.
Thank you so much, Donald. That was wonderful, and I took so many notes myself just on things that I would say we align on, and gave me some additional thoughts. One, I love the fact that we're at a time where there's more women analysts than maybe there was in the past, and maybe still not enough. Two, when you talk about acquiring data, and we'll talk about this in a second, if you don't lead it to action, then what was the point of going through that exercise? What RevGen believes is ultimately to get a data-driven culture, it's a transformation. You can write some activities down on a project plan that you need to work on to make that transformation happen, but ultimately it could be a potentially multi-year investment to see the organization capability you talked about really take hold. So I just wanted to put that out there, that there's no quick hit, there's no 3 things. If you do this, all of a sudden you're a data literate organization, or you're masters at data and analytics. It is a journey that you have to embark on. And the fact that those informal skills and those informal roles are more empowered than ever with technology and with different processes, et cetera. I think there are accelerators. It's just you have to be able to scale those and tap into those and find those people. So RevGen will only share a couple slides here, and then we'll get to Q&A. We have some great questions teed up. First, like I said, to get this people-centric analytics culture going, we believe there's these 4 key components you really need to consider. One is getting to know your community. Love the word community, Donald, that you shared with us. So what is that community? Your data community is everything, not just from your employees and your management and your leaders, but also potentially your vendors, your next hired, to be hired candidates, your partners, et cetera, et cetera. And so once you establish who your community is that needs to be versed in this data, the language of data, you really need to speak to the providers of data and the consumers of data to understand where they are in their journey. Are they at the what is data phase, or are they more mature and you can focus your investment on other elements? 2, defining a common data language. The data literacy matters, and having that commonly defined terms is not just a good place, a have to get started. And we don't just necessarily mean what does this field mean or what type of data is this. Yes, you will get to that work, but also just what is a metric? What are analytics? What is data-driven decision-making, et cetera? Again, we're at a time in business where we have multiple generations in the workforce, some of which were born and grew up data and technology literate, and others did not. So with that common language, you really start to align on how to even have the conversation, let alone advancing it and maturing it. So, and then if you get to that point, it's not necessarily this linear, but enabling people development and growth. So this day and age, just a training or just a manual may not be enough. Really think about providing multimedia support resources, maybe short format videos and tutorials, creating virtual community tools or using tools such as Teams and Slack and whatnot, just so folks can engage and that informality becomes more supported. And then lastly, really important, we believe, is celebrate and even maybe reward the wins you get with data and analytics, and ideally publicly and very frequently. So give a low-level employee an attaboy or a attagirl and a reward or a dinner or something, but really show that this is important to the organization. And then of course we cannot not talk about aligning technology with your community. Not just we need technology, but how do you find the right technology to complement and support your people based on where they are in the maturity curve. So that's our thought on the 4 components. If you don't mind advancing, Lisa, though, to effectively really build and nurture a culture of analytics, like we said, it's super critical to emphasize the people enablement and the process streamlining. These 2 pieces are usually the most often overlooked and overshadowed by the data and technology. We get excited about the tools, the architecture, where is this data? Do we need big data? Do we need AI? And do we need augmented analytics, et cetera? But the people and process to RevGen is a complete core pillar of this culture. And as you can see on the page here, we have a holistic framework for what we know creates a sustainable and successful analytics and insights culture and capability. And as you can see, it starts with business strategy and ends with business value. That action step, Donald, really echoes what you were talking about. You can acquire and understand all you want, but if you don't take action on those insights, you'll never derive to the business value that you're looking to seek, whatever that use case is. And so when you look at those 4 components that go into it, there's lots of, for a general data analytics strategy, there's lots of moving pieces and components we could talk about, but for today, focusing on creating a data-driven culture, you'll see on the right-hand side the considerations that we think are important to help drive that cultural element of it, that maybe potentially grassroots data-driven culture. So on the people side, operating model, and I know we have a question queued up about where should this kind of skill and function sit within the organization. That can matter, and there's no one right answer. Obviously, Donald talked a lot about the skills of your team, not just their technical skills, but maybe their overall data literacy or their storytelling skills in some cases. And then you can't forget change enablement. If this is a transformation, depending on how mature or immature you are, good change enablement and change management techniques are always helpful to drive that. And like we said, analytics in an organization is a capability. It cuts across the enterprise. This is different than just saying finance or IT or sales or marketing or manufacturing. And the rise of the chief data officer over the last several years is evidence that something else was needed to make this a enterprise cross-functional capability. And then real quickly on process, a lot more energy has been spent the last few years really streamlining processes to help put focus on getting to insights faster, but also accurately. So no good conversation about analytics is complete without talking about data governance. But there's also process techniques, some technical, some not, that just make it lower effort or faster to get to those insights, therefore to get to action and value. And like I said, we cannot ignore data and technology. It's a huge part of the conversation. But over the last, say, 5 years, or even maybe more in some cases, new techniques, BI tool vendors are investing in products that are more user-friendly, make it easier for a business analyst to be able to use and get to insight versus maybe having to have a development background and whatnot. So it's really exciting to see how the technology has really come a long way to put the power in not just a technologist's hands, but in a general, potentially user's hands. So those are just some quick thoughts, and wanted to share RevGen's point of view on the topic, and think it complements, Donald, your experience and wisdom quite well. So that, thank you again, Donald, for giving us your time. We are going to pull up some questions here and answer some of those live, and I'll kick some to you, Donald, and maybe there's some for RevGen too. So one I saw, and even if I just comment on it, I'd like to ask it again. Here it is. From your experience, what are your thoughts about creating a centralized data analytics team, or to have analytic leads on each department or each group? That's a structural question, but ultimately, does that matter?
It matters in the sense that a centralized analytics team can be a center of excellence and can provide some of the depth, but it won't transform the company as much as raising the understanding of analytics and the understanding of data and the collaboration around data in a more general way. In other words, it's not a replacement for raising the level of data literacy and analytic understanding in the entire organization. It's all right to have a kind of elite team, but you need to raise typically you need to raise the level of everyone else as well to take fullest advantage of that.
Perfect, thank you. What are your thoughts about data governance and how it fits in the roadmap to becoming a data insight organization? What's the sequence to create momentum and support?
Great. So you cannot afford to overlook data governance. It's actually very critical, but we do need to kind of change our mindset. I suggest sometimes that IT departments have to think of themselves less as data gatekeepers and more as data shopkeepers. Meaning that they should be proactive about how they enable the use of data, rather than having the mindset that their sole function is to stop bad things happening. Because on the one hand, one way of thinking about it is I have to lock everything down. And we even use those phrases, we give people access. We open the door a little bit and we let them in, we give them access. Rather than thinking about how can we provision data in a safe and encouraging way that is fit for purpose, and then enable more people to work with it. Because we've taken the steps to ensure that data is well governed and fit for purpose. So governance is absolutely critical, but sometimes we need to think about it in a different way from the traditional model of gatekeeper governance.
And if I could add to that answer, another part of the question is, what is the sequence to create momentum and support? It's funny, from a consultant's point of view, it's one of the most probably needed skill within an organization, but the hardest to get traction with an organization investing in it. largely based on what you just said, Donald, it very much feels like, well, it has the word governance in it, right? It feels heavy. It feels
Right.
like there's a lot of rules and control and rigor and whatnot. It's not a silver bullet, but one of the approaches we found is when folks find utility and business benefit in some use case of data, and they want that benefit, but then at the same time they see that the quality of the data or the how long it takes to produce that insight is potentially in some cases just silly, then they start to realize, oh, maybe we need some governance. Maybe this would be a better outcome if we had better quality data, or maybe it would be better if we governed this so that it didn't take a month to get to that answer. So what we've found is action and showing what they want, and then the roadblocks of getting there starts to pick away at exposing what data governance kind of programs and projects can help address. So it's a little bit backwards, but it gets to the same
That's
result.
a great point, yeah.
Let's see, I had one. What are some of the challenges or roadblocks you've encountered within your organization or even organizations you've worked with in terms of creating that transformation from tactical to strategic to cultural, and how did you approach or deal with it?
Yeah, so one of the biggest roadblocks might seem a little counterintuitive, which is the desire to kind of do too much too quickly. The idea that more technology is better and more advanced technology must be better, which can actually lead to, first of all, can lead to technology failures. You can kind of get ahead of where you need, where your capabilities are. But the other thing is that the technology that works best for you is the one that's appropriate for your team. And that means the one which is appropriate to where you are now, and which can help you to do some transformation, of course, in terms of doing it better. But not everybody needs to be in the same place. And as I said, not everybody needs to be doing, for example, artificial intelligence. Perhaps it probably has a role within your company, but it's maybe a tactical role. On the other hand, if people are doing reporting, well, maybe some teams need to be doing something a bit more advanced than just reporting. They need to be doing, some real exploration or predictive analytics. But for a lot of teams, just basic reporting is still enough. So one of the things that you can really get yourselves in a kind of mess with, and in a tangle with, is if you try to do too much and you try to bring too many technologies to bear into the organization at one time. It just becomes a mess. It becomes difficult to manage, and it leads to failure. So it's really critical, and that's one of the reasons in fact, sometimes in my game plan, I actually ask people to simplify their technology. Why are you using kind of advanced analytic dashboards here when a basic report is all that's needed? I mean, a really good example of that is in production environments, where very often on the shop floor, what you need is the simplest approach at any one time to give people situational awareness of what's happening on the shop floor. Sure, the marketing people and the product designers can be using more advanced technologies. So, what is the right technology, not just for the organization as a whole, but for that particular organizational unit? What is the right technology? That's the important thing. And, the biggest mistake you can make actually is trying to do too much.
I fully agree. Great answer. Well, we actually addressed, I think, all the questions we got, and now we're also at the top of the hour. So what I would say is thank you all for attending. Hopefully you found something new to share and whatnot. You will get an email with follow-up asking for your feedback of our webinar, but also a replay. And if you at all are interested in continuing this conversation within your organization, just reach out and we'd be happy to have that conversation. So thank you again, Donald, for your time, and thank you all for attending.
Thank you very much.
Have a good day.